My name is Alex Chehorsky.
I'm Regina Ravazova.
We belong to two different generations.
We're former refugees.
I've served and worked in two armies, Russian and American.
And I was among civilians trapped in a war at the age of 7.
I'm a former Putin's classmate.
I'm a mother of 3.
We are now watching the tragedy of Ukraine unfold in front of our eyes.
Watching from across the ocean, it is a distant war, yet very personal. Hello everyone. We are so excited actually to have our first ever guest on our very brand new podcast with Alex. Alex and I are joined by Chloe Arnold. She's a journalist. So good to see you after so many years.
I can't believe it.
Hi, Chloe.
Hi.
You know, Chloe, it's 18 years since we met.
I think it might be 17, Regina.
Was it 2005?
Yes, I think. And where did we meet?
Beslan, North Ossetia. I want you to tell us more about it. Tell us how we met.
I think that it was 2005. And I think the reason I know that was because I was quite pregnant with my second child. And I came down to Beslan to cover the first anniversary of the school siege. And if anyone is familiar with what happened, it was the first day of school. I believe 2004. Is that right, Regina?
That is correct. Now I'm thinking, I think it was first anniversary of that tragedy.
That's right.
Yeah.
I was sent to cover the first anniversary of that school siege. So around 1,500 people, I think, had been taken hostage on the first day of school. Families, because on the first day of school in North Ossetia, which is in southern Russia, which is where we were, first day of school is a big celebration. Children go to school with flowers, they're wearing their best clothes, they've got ribbons in their hair, the girls, and the boys are wearing suits. It's really a big occasion. And they were taken hostage by people who were fighting in the war in Chechnya, which was not too far away. It was a 3-day siege. A lot of people were killed. Most of the men were killed right at the beginning, and the rest of the people were held hostage. There were some negotiations whereby women with tiny children were allowed to leave the building. Very sad stories of whether they should stay because they had older children or leave just with the baby. And after 3 days, Russian troops stormed the building and there was sort of a shootout. Some of the bombs that the terrorists had laid went off and many people lost their lives. It was a massive tragedy. So on the first anniversary, or approaching the first anniversary, I was asked to go down and cover the story for the BBC and also for a magazine called Marie Claire. So I went down there with a photographer and I met Regina, and she was from the area and knew the story very well and knew a lot of the parents who'd been involved, the mothers who were in the building when it happened. And she was incredible in putting me in touch with these people, and I spoke to them. And I remember that I was quite pregnant with my second child, and it really struck home, perhaps even more for me being there, what had happened. Possibly it made it easier for me to approach people because, obviously I was going to have a child fairly soon and a lot of people had lost children. But I remember doing a lot of crying. I remember listening to some absolutely tragic stories. And I remember another story, I don't know if you remember it, Regina, interviewing one of the very few men to have survived the siege. And he told us a really sad story about how, just by coincidence, a few days before the hostage taking, he had read in a magazine, "What do you do if you're taken hostage?" And he read through it thinking, well, this will never happen to me. And then sure enough, the following week he was taken hostage. He just felt this incredible sense of guilt because he had survived. He'd remembered, keep your head down, be the grey man, don't say anything. And somehow they'd missed him when they took the other men away and shot them. And that was a story which really sticks with me. But that was how we met. And here we are meeting again now, 17 years later.
Yeah. I couldn't say a word in English. Chloe has Russian, right? Chloe, you speak Russian.
That is exactly right.
Where did you learn Russian?
So I actually learnt Russian at school, high school, in the UK, in London. I started learning when I was 16. It was incredibly difficult. I couldn't master the alphabet for about a year. But I'd done other languages before that. I'd done French and German. I'd done Latin and Greek in my first school. And there was a very inspiring Russian teacher at my school. And so I thought, well, look, if not now, then never. And so I started. But it was only when I went to Russia for the first time in 1991 to stay with the most lovely family in St Petersburg that I really fell in love with the place. And then when I left school, high school, I went to teach English in St Petersburg. I fell in love with the city again. I fell in love with the Russian literature. I fell in love with a boy. And the rest is history, as they say. Actually, no, that boy is not history. He's moved on. But since then, I've had a real affinity with Russia and Russians, Russian literature and Russian language. And I went on to do a degree in Russian and history at Edinburgh University. And as soon as I left, I got a job on the Moscow Times newspaper in 1997. And I then carried on as a journalist.
Yeah, I want to say one thing about, I remember you distinctly because I was very, very starting journalist at that time. You know, as a reporter, you start freelancing for a lot of agencies outside and inside of your region. That time was fairly, compared with what is happening right now with freedom of speech in Russia, it was really free time. Like we could actually cover things. We could actually report on things that mattered. And I remember you coming, and I'm just starting in my profession, and I remember a couple of things about you, but one that stood out for me, the way just I kept observing you, you know, this professional is coming from the West and he has all these, you know, the journalism that started actually not here, but somewhere, you know, and we're trying to learn all these concepts and principles, and you're coming in and you would do things like, I remember in Beslan on one of our trips, you're like, I just want to sit here. Can I just sit here? Or you would just take off and just stroll the streets, you know, in complete silence. Just sit there, take in the whole surrounding around you. And I carried it through so many years. Like I never forgot that. Because at that time I thought, why would she do this? And now it makes so much sense.
When you were studying in St. Petersburg, was that a university program?
No, in fact, in St. Petersburg, I just went to teach at a school. When I left high school at aged 18, the lovely family that I'd spent 3 weeks with a couple of years before organised a job for me teaching in a school. And what I remember was St. Petersburg in sort of October, November, December is so cold and so dark. And I remember going into the school in the morning, it would be dark. I would be wearing a coat, a scarf, a hat, boots, gloves, which I would keep on all day because there was no heating in the school. I would teach for 2 or 3 hours. And by the time I left school, it was already dark again. Because, of course, it's the complete opposite of those wonderful white nights you get in the summer. In the winter, it barely gets light at all. But, you know, I was just so in love with the place. And I'd read Dostoevsky and I'd read Gogol. And I walked up Nevsky Prospect thinking of Gogol's short story. I used to walk through Sinyaya Ploshchad's, which is where Raskolnikov murders the two people in Crime and Punishment. You know, I was so deeply entrenched in it, and I found it
So you just
wonderful.
drank that whole Russian poison, the full cup of it, right?
I did. I think other people have done it before me.
Absolutely.
I drank it right. Dudna, as they say, right to the bottom.
Especially in my hometown, yeah.
But I'm a bit of a traitor because I then went on to Moscow and I spent a year at Moscow State University. Well, actually, I say a year. I left after 3 months because I got a job as the nightclub correspondent on the Moscow Times. And you know, I have to say what Regina says is absolutely true about that time. So we're talking post-Gorbachev, we're talking free Russia, very, very young country, and no sign yet of Mr. Putin. So Yeltsin is in charge. It's all a little bit of a mess. But there is freedom of speech. And if you want to find out about the voucher system, if you want to find out about corruption in the east of the country, if you want to find out about anything, you can. And you can talk to anyone, and you can travel anywhere, and you can do anything. And they were great years to be a journalist in Russia. And I remember one of the first stories I went to cover was a miners' strike in Siberia, in the Kuzbas, the coal region of Russia. And I was sent down. I was so young, I was so green, I didn't really know much, but I went down there with my notebook and my pencil, and I went to speak to miners who had not been paid for up to a year. They weren't receiving wages. And they were standing, blocking the Trans-Siberian Railway. So I talked to them. You know, you could approach anyone. No one was scared of journalists. People wanted to talk. And they said to me, when they found out I was British, they said, oh, yes, we remember the miners' strikes in Great Britain, in England and Wales in the 1980s. And we used to send food rations to the miners in England. So then we had a sort of affinity and a connection. It was an amazing time to be a journalist. And then if you move forward 10 years and think about censorship and self-censorship, actually, you know, not particularly you can't write that story, but thinking, do I want to write this story? Because what might be the repercussions? And that's almost
the usual.
worse.
The usual Russian thing.
Yeah.
Chloe, are you actively still covering Russia? Tell us about this whole process of, you know, if I kind of fast forward, but not really, to today. How was that situation that was happening and changing in Russia slowly with Putin? How did it affect your work?
So I spent 2 years on the Moscow Times newspaper, and I left at the end of 1998, which actually coincided with one of the first market crashes and people losing all their money. Really, the default, it was called. And I went to interview people who had lost everything. After that, I spent 3 years actually in Azerbaijan. So I was living in Baku, again, still speaking Russian, still in the former Soviet Union. And it was after that I went back to Russia again in 2004. And of course, things had changed. Mr. Putin was in charge. But again, I was able to travel a lot, to do some amazing stories. I mean, that time when I was there, I'm just thinking of some of the stories I did. So one of them, I was asked to interview the man who, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, was on the submarine, and it was his job to look after the nuclear warhead. He slept on that nuclear warhead. And I remember interviewing him about, being in the Bay of Pigs, and the American submarine was, just a mile or two away from them. They were both under the water. They both needed to come up for air. And the Russian submariners came up onto the top and looked across, and they could see the Americans. And they were, out on the deck, and they were all wearing shorts. And this was the first time that anyone had seen a black man, a black American, black anyone. That was one thing. And then the next thing was that the black submariner brought out a saxophone and started playing, and they just found it incredible. Well, as this was going on, the world was in crisis, and are we going to go to nuclear war? But that was a very personal touch to it. And the other story I really remember from that time was interviewing two musicians who had been playing at the Proms in London. The Proms is a set of classical music concerts that goes over 2 weeks at the Royal Albert Hall in London. It was 1967, I believe, and it was the first time that the Soviet orchestra had been invited to play in London, and it was the first night, and they were opening. And that very morning, Soviet tanks had rolled into Prague. So the news came out, the Soviets have taken the Czechoslovakian capital, and these musicians are thinking, well, how are we going to play, tonight when, our country has invaded another country in Europe? Perhaps we should call it off. But no, they decided everyone said, no, we'll carry on. And they did carry on. And when they went in for the rehearsal, which then led to the concert, some people were shouting traitors to them outside the hall. They had tomatoes thrown at them, and they were thinking, maybe we shouldn't go ahead with this. But then they sat down, and every time they were about to start playing, someone would shout something in the audience, but eventually everyone quieted down and they started to play. And can you believe they were playing Dvorak, a Czech, and Rostropovich was playing. He was the cellist playing. And so these two violinists that I interviewed, I said, what was happening? And they said, well, we didn't see his face, but from his shoulders we could see he was crying all the way through the concert. And at the end they had a standing ovation. Anyway, after that, I spent some time in Algeria, just for a bit of a change. We thought it might be quiet after Russia, where there was always something happening. But then the Arab Spring hit, so we were quite busy in Algeria. And then to Poland for 3 years, and then back to Russia again in 2015. And things really had changed then. I was working for the BBC Russian service then, and you really did feel a different atmosphere, certainly for journalists. I noticed people were more reticent to speak to us. Sometimes, when you said you worked for the BBC, some people were sort of out and out angry, and there was more fear of foreign journalists just not really wanting to talk to protect themselves.
That's so interesting. So, and of course, a big part of it is something that people constantly hear on TV, on major Russian media, that these are foreign spies, and this is why we left country. This is why I never intended to leave. I really loved the work I did. I loved the place I lived in, but I had to go through this whole absolutely unnecessary. Sometimes when I look back, I'm like, I didn't rob anyone. I never, I was never bribed. Or I didn't give bribe to. Like, I never committed any crimes. And yet someone who does that on a daily basis, they decide the fate of people, that their sole job is basically to report what's really happening on the ground.
No, but that's what makes you dangerous.
Right.
Yeah, it's really sad. And I was the same. We didn't really want to leave. We spent 4 years there the last time we were there, from 2015 to 2019. My husband is also a journalist. He was running the Reuters news agency, and they were doing a lot of long investigations about corruption, particularly with Gazprom, which is the gas company.
Wow. And
but at the same time, you would sort of feel threatened, and funny things would happen in your house, and you weren't entirely sure what was going on. And it really reached a point where we thought, we've got kids, and we had the luxury of being able to leave. We weren't Russian. My husband very, very rarely cries, but he cried because he said, that's our home. I feel it's my home. And how can I ever go back there until there's a regime change?
You guys are foreigners, and I, besides this outrage and sadness and tears, the thing that doesn't leave my heart, Chloe, nowadays is this tremendous guilt, because it's my country. I'm American, but I used to be Russian. So this tremendous guilt from yesterday, someone reached out to me through my local friend, connected me to this lady from Ukraine who has issues bringing her father into the United States. And after I talked to her, I said, okay, let me see what I can do. And then every time I finish the conversation or start the conversation with someone from Ukraine, I said, and the last thing I want to say is I'm so sorry for things that my former country is doing to yours. Because you cannot, it's on me now. It's on me, and I carry it around, and I think I'll carry it around until, my whole life.
Yeah, I know, and that's so sad, because so many people don't agree with what's going on. When I flew back from Warsaw this time round, I was standing in the passport queue. Now that Britain has, of course, left Europe because of that wonderful thing called Brexit, I'm being ironic there, we have to stand in the queue that, not the fast track queue. So you're standing in the queue with non-European nationals. And I was saying to the Poles in the queue ahead of me, you're European, go to the other queue, which was also reducing the queue for me. So it was a little bit sneaky. Then I said to some people, are you Polish? And they said, oh, no, we're Belarusian, but we live in Poland. And I said, oh, that's interesting. And they said, oh, we live in Poland. And I said, what do you make of that they were young? And I said, what do you make of what's going on? And they said, we're so ashamed. We are just so ashamed.
But you know, Chloe, I left the country in 1987. I was trying to leave since 1980, but I was not allowed because of my parents. You know, my parents were one of the first nuclear scientists in the country. And for almost 10 years, I was running away from, the authorities and everything. So the moment the door opened, 1 inch, I was out. But somewhere in the 91, I think it's the only article I wrote in my life. I'm not a journalist. And I said it in that article that unless the Communist Party will be under some kind of a court, and unless the Communist Party and NKVD, KGB will be brought to something similar to the Nuremberg, it will all happen again, and it will be worse than before. And that was not only my opinion. There were a group of us, more or less, who were thinking that. Because of that, in 35 years of me out of Russia, I've been back once for 1 day.
Why did you go back, Sash?
A good friend here who gave me my first professional job. I'm a geologist. I'm an exploration geologist. He was screwed up by some kind of an agency in Russia professionally, and he needed my help as a geologist. So we went to Kyrgyzstan. I did some work for him there, and I just jumped on a plane and landed in St Petersburg, get all my friends, we spent an evening together, and I left. Because these things were not done, because the formal proceedings of bringing to the court this whole criminal system was never done, and the West never insisted on that. The same people came to power, only now their hands were untied completely. And that story repeated again, and what we have today. I mean, Putin is my classmate. We both entered the Leningrad University in 1970. It's a different department. I'm in geology, but he was in law, the юридический факультет.
Yeah.
But we had a lot of common lectures. And of course, you know that every university had a military training. So 1 day a week, we were all at the military training thing. So I knew him, and I knew all these bastards with him, especially well, I knew Sergei Ivanov. And it was obvious to me that nothing will stop these guys. I had no idea that they will ever come to power, but then when the Putin was brought to power by Yeltsin, I just told my guys, I said, that's it, we're done. This guy is bringing the whole structure back. What I didn't realize that he was, I use the word crazy, meaning not that he's not rational, but he's what he believes in, what he chooses to believe in is a completely crazy thing. And, that recent thing in Ukraine, it was just a bloom on the top, a cherry on the top of a pie of that whole terrible thing that happened in Russia since 15th century, when the security powers came to power, and when the Russia for 500 years were under, one way or another, under the influence of the criminal security forces. They took many, many different shapes, but they were the same people, basically.
Sasha, that must have been an incredible night for you in St Petersburg, though, with all your friends.
It was an unusual situation, yes. Also, we were all geologists, most of us, so we spent before then years and years, together in a very distant corner of the country, and you know what it does to people, you grow closer. And it was 2004, so it was kind of a good time, more or less, for them there, and they had hopes, and of course, I did not have any hopes at all, and that was also a point of a little bit of a contention. But you see, what happened with me is that when Russia invaded Afghanistan on the 26th, I think it was December of 1979, I said that that's the end of the country. And a lot of people were arguing with me, but I saw it completely clearly. I saw that the country will never get intact out of that war. It took my guys years and years and years to understand that. But for me, it was a dead place. The moment the country entered, and the moment the country now entered the Ukraine war, it's the same thing again. I can absolutely 100% see that the Ukrainian will kick ass like no one ever in the history kick ass, because I know these guys. And I don't know if you I recommend everybody to watch that Dudaev tiny speech of Dudaev about Ukrainians.
Johar Dudaev.
You remember Johar Dudaev, right?
Yeah, of course.
The Chechen.
Yeah.
Because he said it in 1992, I believe, that the Russia will at some point attack Ukraine, and the Ukrainians will be the end of Russia as we know it today. And he was an absolute prophet, and I completely agree with him. And that we see now that drama unfolded in front of our eyes. Russia will not get out of this thing intact. It will not be like, okay, the peace treaty, blah, blah, blah. No, it won't be that way.
I think one thing that this has done is it's united Ukrainians. If this had happened 10 years ago in Ukraine, it may not have had the same effect, because these are young countries. But today you see absolute resilience. You see people
it's a nation now.
saying, it
was not a nation
Ukrainian.
before.
My mother is Russian, or my grandparents are Russian, but I am Ukrainian. And I have heard that so many times from listening to the radio and, interviews with people in cellars, in bomb shelters, and hiding in the woods. And, they say, I am Ukrainian. Doesn't matter what my blood is, doesn't matter what my heritage is, I am Ukrainian. And there's a real sense that when this is all over, Ukrainians will come together and rebuild their country brick by brick, and the world will help them.
And it's not even about rebuilding, because that's secondary in my opinion. The most important thing is that Ukraine is now a true nation. They were born in this. The moment the Russia attacked, they were born. Because I haven't spent much time in Ukraine. I've been here and there. But from 2010 to 2012, I was with the U.S. Army in Afghanistan for 3 years. And at the end of 2012, I went to Ukraine because I was looking for a place in the world where I can bring my Russian geologist, American geologist, and Afghan geologist without visas, because otherwise that was a nightmare. And that was Ukraine. So I spent 4 months there preparing. It didn't happen at the end, but the Pentagon wanted me to have that center to put it in Ukraine. And I lived in Lviv, and I lived in Odessa, where I had some very distant relatives. And I understood that that was not a nation. It was a collection of groups, nationalities. Everybody was pulling, to themselves. They did not have understand what a country was. The Ukrainian army was a joke. When I was in Afghanistan, there was a small detachment of a Ukrainian army. It was so pitiful to watch these guys. You know what I'm saying? And then, bang, this thing happens, and now you have Russians, the Ukrainian Russians, and Ukrainians, and there's no difference. And you have Azov, which is probably more Russian than Ukrainian, on the ethnic calculator, so to speak. Nobody cares, nobody's even thinking about that. And that's how my idiot classmate wanted to destroy a country and created a country. If that is not that example how, the evil
create something good.
Yeah, create
and
something good.
Amazing.
It's just,
yeah.
A tremendous price, unfortunately.
As usual.
And we're not going to know the cost until later. It's only just trickling out now. But I've been on the border twice now since the war began, and just speaking to people, there is such a sense of Ukrainianness. And when we say goodbye to people, we would say Slava Ukraina, and they would say Geroyam Slava. It was like a sort of motto that, everyone just said. And, that there was just this feeling of a nation, and a nation under threat, but a nation that needs to be protected.
Tell us, it's a good segue to actually, how we reconnected, which I was so happy to hear from you. Chloe, you just came back from what was it, Tomaso Lubinsky?
Tomaszów, yeah.
So
yeah.
I see it's southeast of Poland. It's really close to the border, and it's close to, what is it, 1 hour from Lviv?
Yes, exactly. So basically, when the war broke out, I was horrified. I couldn't believe it. From day one, I was thinking, what can I do? What should I do? I was just racking my brains. And then a former colleague of mine from the BBC was on the border. He was reporting on that border. It's called Hrebena in Poland, and in just the other side in Ukraine is called Rawa-Ruska. And he put out this call on Facebook saying, if anyone speaks Russian or Ukrainian and can get to this border, there is a desperate need for translators. And the thing is that the Poles, as we know, have been absolutely amazing. The vast bulk of Ukrainians who have left the country have gone to Poland. They've gone to other countries too. They've gone to Romania, they've gone to Moldova, and other neighbouring countries, Hungary. But most of them have gone to Poland. And Poland now has, I think, more than 2 million Ukrainian refugees. It's very, very full. And the Poles have just been fantastic at opening their arms and their hearts and their homes and donating and doing what they can. But there is this communication issue. And when people cross the border and they're just faced with this great unknown, and somebody comes up with sweets for the children, that's wonderful, but they need to say to someone, what do we do next? Please, could you advise? And that's where, as a Russian speaker or as a Ukrainian speaker, there are less of them, you can be useful. So I decided that I would go. So I left my kids and my husband behind in Paris, and I got on a plane to Warsaw, and then I drove down to Tomaszów, and the next day I went to the border. And that first time round, we're talking sort of 2 or 3 weeks into the war, there were so many people crossing. They were mostly coming from central Ukraine. There were a lot of people coming from Kiev. And I sort of quickly became an expert on Ukrainian geography. I'd say, oh, yes, Zaporizhia, yes. Sumy, yes, I remember. Sumy, of course, further east. Oh, yes, we saw a girl from Sumy earlier today. Perhaps you know her. They were coming from Kharkiv. They were coming from Kherson. They were coming from Izium. They were coming from Vinnytsia. And they would cross. And so what would happen at that border crossing, which is one of the smaller border crossings, in ordinary times, it's just a road crossing. The border between Ukraine and Poland is quite porous anyway, and there's a lot of travel backwards and forwards in ordinary times. There are a lot of Ukrainians working in Poland. A lot of Poles moved to Britain when Poland became a member of the European Union, and Ukrainians stepped in to take on some of the jobs that the Poles who'd left Poland did. So that border was quite porous, and so there was a fair amount of traffic coming through that border, but mostly, as I say, in vehicles. When the war began, obviously the traffic went up tenfold, 100-fold, and people were coming across on foot. And a lot of them had people to meet them. They had relatives, they had friends, they had acquaintances, they had friends of friends, and they organised transport. Some people just drove across and they just needed to stop to have a cup of tea and go to the loo and move on. But the ones that were worrying were the ones who came across. They'd been dropped at the border on the other side, and they arrived and they just simply had no idea what to do. And those are the ones who said, okay, let's think about this. Do you know anyone in Europe? And they might say, well, I've got a friend in Germany. Okay, let's look at Germany. And then you would start scrolling through websites. You know, it's funny how wars are nowadays, where everyone's on their phone. And there's a website called Shelter for Ukraine that's been set up, I think, by 2 Harvard students. And they've basically said, anyone who's offering accommodation, come onto this website, tell us what you've got. And then, you know, Ukrainians or anyone who's helping Ukrainians can look through it. And that's how we found the first family for a girl called Alina, who was 24. She had crossed the border with her son, who was 18 months old. He'd just started walking. And Alina was absolutely lost. Beautiful girl in a totally inappropriate coat for travelling, light pink and fluffy. And she had left behind everyone in Kiev. She had travelled with her husband to the border actually twice. She was diabetic and she was hoping that her husband would get an exemption to be allowed to leave the country because, of course, men aged between 18 and 60 are not supposed to leave the country unless there's a reason. So the first time they had gone to the border and the border guards had said, no, you can't leave. And so they all went back to Kiev. And the second time they went again, hoping, my wife is diabetic. And again, the border guard said no. And this time her husband said, you have to go. I don't want you here. And he pushed her over the border and, they had a quick kiss goodbye and she arrived and she was like a rabbit in headlights. She'd never been outside Ukraine before. She'd never travelled. And here she was with her little boy who was a little bit ill, lovely child, just started walking and she couldn't do anything. She couldn't sit down because he was toddling and falling. And we thought, this girl needs our help. And we found this amazing family in Germany. And the thing is, it's a leap of faith. It's a leap of faith for the German family. It's a leap of faith for Alina. It's a leap of faith for us helping. But the girl that I was working with on that occasion, Ali, another Russian-speaking friend of mine from London, flew with Alina to Germany and met the family, who were wonderful. And they are set up now. And since then, Alina's mum and her youngest brother, because she left behind both parents, both sets of grandparents, 3 brothers and her husband. But since then, their village outside Kiev has been evacuated and her mother and youngest brother, who's 17, have been allowed to leave. So we were able to help them get to Germany as well. So there's now 4 of them. And this lovely German family have found them a house to live in. They're not paying rent there. The person whose house it is has said they can live there for free. And so that was one good story. And so that's what we were doing. That's what, when we went down there, we were talking to people, reassuring them at first, come, sit down, have some tea, have some soup. There were amazing volunteers. There's something called World Central Kitchen, which is an American organization that were producing 100,000 meals a day in a giant kitchen near Przemysl, south of where we were, and ferrying them off to border posts along the Polish-Ukrainian border, also the Moldovan and Romanian borders every day. And we would say, sit down, have something to eat, get yourself a free SIM card, and then tell us, where would you like to go? And then that's when the discussions would begin. And you can't help everyone. I mean, you can't even help a tiny percentage of anyone. But you can help a very, very few people, and that's what we were able to do.
One thing, Chloe, I don't know if you know it or not, about the Polish-Ukrainian thing, and somehow it's not a very well-known situation, but Poles and Ukrainians were absolutely at each other's throats. Almost
I have heard
the
this.
whole of the first part of the 20th century. I don't think there were atrocities in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. I don't think there were atrocities in Europe that could be compared with what happened between Poles and Ukrainians. There were several well-known films that were actually, they are now available, but they were suppressed both on the Polish side and Ukrainian side. And to me, what happened between Ukraine and Poland now is just an absolute, it's not like a miracle. It's something that I think is completely unprecedented.
But Alex, do you get a feeling perhaps that Poles have been through their own more recent history with Solidarność and things like that? Do you not get a sense that perhaps they looked at Ukraine and what was happening there and thought, we understand what it is to live in that fear with that?
Oh, absolutely.
With
of
that
course.
cloud.
Of
And so therefore we stand with you and we
Yes,
will help
this
you.
is true for Poles. This is true for all ex-Warsaw countries. This is true for the Baltics. And unfortunately, the only people who don't understand it is the governments of France and Germany.
Yes, that's probably another story for another day. And don't
Absolutely.
even let us get started on Great Britain
And what
its
you're
role in the
telling
whole process.
and what you're saying about the Germans, the people, it's just amazing, and it brings my heart out. But when it comes to the German and the French government, I think that this is a beginning of the end of the old EU. this thing will not just go away. They betrayed the Western civilization that way, and they will not be forgiven for that. Congratulations with your government, by the way.
Britain is difficult because we left Europe and because of Brexit. We now have a visa system. And it means that if you want to come to Britain, well, you can. And there are lots and lots of British families who say exactly the same thing. We have room. We would welcome you here and you can stay for as long as you like. But you have to get a visa. And the whole process has really been, it's been a joke and it's been shambolic. But actually, it's been quite shameful, I think. And I'm quite ashamed to be British and see this going on because Ukrainians leave and they don't necessarily have their international passports because, of course, Ukrainians have both an international passport, a Zagran passport, as it's called, and an internal passport, which everybody has, but not so many people have international passports. And if you want to go to Britain and you don't have your biometric passport, then you've got to go through this whole process of going to a visa application centre and doing your fingerprints and filling in this incredibly convoluted and complicated form. And then you wait. And we were helping a family of 4 from Kharkiv, mum, 3 of her children, her eldest son has had to stay behind. The eldest daughter has cerebral palsy and brain damage, and she needed help. She didn't know where to go. And so we've managed to find a family for her in the south of England who would take her in. And we went through the visa process. So that began with a 2-hour bus journey to Rzeszów in Poland with all the children and the mum, including the child with cerebral palsy. Then they had their fingerprints taken. And the application that we filled in, me, my British friend and my friend's American son, it took us 3 hours. We're native English speakers to fill in this form. So how, non-English speaking Ukrainians are supposed to fill in this form, I just have no idea. And the thing that got me most was you needed to have evidence to show that you were living in Ukraine before January the 1st, 2022. In other words, that you weren't jumping in on this scheme, not having lived in Ukraine. And if you don't have proof of this, then please could you tell us why? And there was a little box. And in that box, I wrote, fleeing a war zone in haste. Because honestly, what are your house is being shelled. What are you supposed to, just hold on a minute. I've got to get my utility bills from the last 3 months. Hold fire, everyone. It's just crazy. And so many people have applied and there's this sort of, the British government is saying, oh, well, we have to do security checks. And it's really, really shameful, actually.
No, I hear you completely. But what I'm saying is that it is incredibly, that helping people individually is one of the most important humanitarian actions. But at the same time, helping Ukraine not to be destroyed, helping the society and the country. And England play, in my opinion, even a more important role than the United States in that. And the way, militarily, British help is absolutely unparalleled, in my opinion. And the way how Britain was organizing, Poland and the Baltic states, and Ukraine into a separate political, so to speak, entity, if I can say that word. It also, in my opinion, incredible. And my friends who are the Ukrainian military commanders, the people in the field, they told me many times that they wish the United States will have the resolve. And it's not, US probably brings more, weapons per se, but the attitude, the way the Brits deal with Ukraine, that the fact that the prime minister came to Kiev, that moral support, that is, in my opinion, unparalleled, and you should be proud of that.
Good. I'm glad to hear that from you, Alex. I'm not remotely proud of my Prime Minister, who is, in my view, a buffoon and a clown, but that's more internal politics than global politics. But what I will say is just, being on the border, there was obviously there was this huge wave of people crossing, more at night because they would be held up on the border. And of course, with curfew in Ukraine, it meant you couldn't set out in the morning until curfew had ended. And then you got to the border and there's this great long queue. So actually, there's only a trickle of people coming over in the morning and the afternoon. By the evening, that becomes a steady flow. But interestingly, there was a lot of traffic going the other way. A few buses, humanitarian vehicles, a lot of stuff that across Europe, people have been collecting clothes and blankets and shampoo and food, and all of this stuff is making its way to the refugee centres and to the border and into Ukraine. But one little story that I will tell you, which is quite funny, is when I was there at the border, I noticed a table which had lots of food that you could help yourself to. And there was a packet of instant mashed potato powder from Tesco's, which is one of our supermarkets. And somebody who was there at the same time as me took a photo of it and put it on Facebook and said, "People of the UK, please keep giving. Your stuff is coming through." And underneath somebody had written, "Haven't these people suffered enough?"
That's funny.
In response to the packet of instant mashed potato powder. But anyway, I digress. At the border, there's a lot of traffic going the other direction, and very fascinating to see these great big unmarked lorries and trucks, and just wondering what is in the back of that truck. And I wandered down, being the sort of nosy and curious journalist that I am, and tried to understand where the trucks were coming from and what was in them. I think I would need a bit of a lesson in how to read a truck. So most of the number plates were Polish. Some of the trucks had French writing on them. Most of the drivers seemed to be Polish, but I didn't really talk to them. But unmarked, and a lot, and going in the other direction into Ukraine. So I know what I would want to be in the back of those trucks, but there was just no knowing.
Thanks God that there's no knowing.
Tell us about you're doing some fundraising, as I know. Tell us a little bit more about it.
Yeah, so before I left, the main mission was just to go and to translate and to be useful in any way I could be useful. But before I left, I thought, well, maybe I could just set up a fundraiser and, if I've got a bit of money to bring with me, then maybe it could be useful. And honestly, the day I opened my fundraising page, on which I'd asked for £1,500, which is probably around $2,000, I collected £7,500. And it's now, almost tripled. People are just so desperate to help. I suppose, like me sitting at home thinking, what can I do? And I have this tiny useful skill, which is that I speak Russian. But people who don't have that and say, what can we do? And somebody that they know opens a page. Honestly, the money has just come flooding in. And so as a result of that, we've been able to concretely help the people. When Alina needed to go to Germany, well, we could buy her plane tickets. When one of the saddest ones, 4 grown-ups who were all deaf and dumb, and 2 children who could talk and could hear. It was difficult for us even to communicate at first, and they couldn't write very well either. But we sat down and we said, where do you know somebody? And it turned out they knew someone in Bielsko-Biała in Poland. So then we started looking for somewhere for them to live. And we were able to find them, short-term accommodation in Bielsko-Biała, just to set them up. It's not long-term, it's not a long-term solution, but just somewhere for them to go in their rackety old Lada, which just about made it to Bielsko-Biała, and then arrive and know that for the next 3 weeks they could just breathe, relax, think about what to do for the future. And that, I felt that if there is a God, then I think possibly he might have been involved in this story. When they arrived, and we'd booked them 2 little flats next to each other, the lady who cleaned the flats was Ukrainian. But not just that, she could also sign.
Interesting.
And it really was amazing. They got there and they could communicate with somebody who could sign. Now we're still in touch, because we keep in touch with everyone we've helped. And do you need more help? What you doing? Where have you moved on? we keep in touch. So now their plan is to go to, wait for it, Uzbekistan. I'm not quite sure how they're going to get there. But anyway, we're sort of keeping across everyone and trying to make sure that they're still okay and can we help you further. Another funny little one, I say funny, none of this is funny. A lady crossed the border and she was really sort of staggering under the weight of these 2 really big cat baskets. She had 4 cats with her. She ran a cat sanctuary outside Kharkiv. She'd spent a month in a cellar. And she'd managed to get out and bring 4 of the cats with her. 3 of them were fine and 4 of them was quite badly, well, it was ill and it was injured. And we said, sit down, have some tea, we'll get some cat food for the cats. And what's your plan? And we said, where are you going? And she said, Miami. So we said, right, okay, we can rise to this. And then at that moment, this very well-dressed and quite posh Polish lady arrived from Warsaw and said, I'm going back to Warsaw. And we said, what do you think about bringing the cat lady there? And she said, of course, put the cats in the back. And she got on her phone and she found places immediately for 2 of the cats. And then 2 days later, we got a message from Cat Lady. I'm in Miami with 2 cats. She made it. So, in amongst this incredible sadness and tragedy, there were stories, there were good stories. And the other thing that I always used to tell myself, because, so many people crossing the border and you can't even possibly help a tiny fraction of them. But I remember this story, and it's a myth, and I don't know which culture it comes from. But there's a little boy on the beach with his grandmother, and they're walking along, and it's dusk. And all these starfish have washed up on the beach, hundreds and thousands of starfish. And if they don't get back in the water, then they're going to die. And the little boy picks up a starfish, and he goes to the sea, and he throws the starfish in. And then he comes back and he picks up another starfish and he throws it back into the sea. And his grandmother says, don't bother doing that. There's no point in doing that. You can't possibly save all the starfish. Just don't bother. And the little boy says, but Granny, I can save this starfish. And that's what I used to say. That's what I used to say to the people we were working with. Just think of the starfish. We can't save all of them. We just can't. But if we can just save this 1 or this 2 or this 5, then we'll have done something. All right, I must go and make my children their supper.
Thank you so much.
Bye, Chloe.
Lovely
Thank
to
you.
talk to you again. Good night. Goodbye.